So our last presentation is Pauric Marray from Quigg Golden. Those of you here at last year's conference, we had David O'Brien, Chair of the Government Central Contracts Committee, and he informed us of progress and agenda for the ongoing review of the Irish Public Works contracts. So today Pauric Marray, who's a director at Quigg Golden, specialising in procurement and construction law, is going to take up the baton and inform us of the changes stemming from that review. Pauric has over 10 years' experience advising on construction claims and disputes involving mediation, conciliation, adjudication and arbitration. Pauric is recognised for bringing a practical and commercially focused approach to all matters he's involved with. He always regularly provides advice in relation to procurement issues and has developed a particular specialism in supporting suppliers through tender processes. As a certified mediator, Pauric has experience in facilitating parties to resolve their disputes before court. He's also a qualified trainer and has worked extensively in design and implementation of training programs. Sure, many of us have been to Quigg Golden's programs for both public and private organisations on a range of legal issues affecting the construction industry. Pauric is also the lead trainer on the Public Works Contracts courses provided by Quigg Golden for Engineers Ireland. So Pauric's availability here today, I know he's arranged at relatively short notice, so thank you for your assistance there, was specifically requested by SCSI so we could get an update on the contracts. So thank you, Pauric.
I think part of the reason that this was scheduled for this time is so I could calm you all down after the macro excitement of Chris's speech, with a little bit of construction professionals' favourite thing, which is construction contract detail, which I know we're all very fond of. So I promise to calm you all down before you get back into the traffic, and trying to get through this as relatively briefly as possible. As I am the last speaker, I will be happy to take questions as I go if people have questions. Otherwise, you can store them up until the end. So, as Martin's mentioned, the changes to the public works contracts were for a long time discussed, and I suppose much signposted. What we've ended up with is three primary areas of change. Bill of Quantities has been returned to be the primary pricing document, particularly only in relation to employer-designed contracts or employer-designed projects. We now have some issues or some clarification in relation to specialist works procurement. Again, something that there was certain issues with. And we now also have some new dispute management procedures. And these three are changes to the public works contract, which I suppose sit apart from the other change in the industry, which we won't discuss in any great detail, but the introduction of the Construction Contracts Act finally, and what impact that might ultimately have. To date, it hasn't had a significant impact, but we may get there in the end. Each of these three things, I suppose, were designed to solve a perception of a problem in the industry. And in relation to the bills of quantities and what's changed there, I'll start off this by insulting everybody in the room. The reason the problem here was everybody in this room's fault, and the economy's fault. So let's blame macro and micro for this. Because of low design fees, that people weren't being able to command the fee they may have been used to, potentially the designs weren't quite as full as they should have been, which led to quantity surveyors having to create bills of quantities which could only be as detailed as the design that they had in front of them, or at least that's what they would say. We also then had contractors who maybe on the one hand looked at drawings and specification which they may technically have been required to price, but ignored that because they knew that no other contractors in the industry were doing that, and in order to win work at a time of a low point in our economy, had to price based on bills of quantities that they maybe didn't have total faith in. And ultimately that led to clients being unsatisfied, but also was clients' fault as well, because they weren't really gripping the problem initially. The whole point of the Capital Works Management Framework was, particularly in relation to employer designed, is all predicated on the fact that there's initial design and we don't change it. And as we all know, that hasn't actually happened. and probably is slightly wishful thinking on most of our parts. But that's the reason why, and out of that came I suppose, people looking for price certainty when that wasn't really ever going to be possible. And lots of claims arising, plus when we add in the additional risks that were passed on to people, left a lot of contractors, consultants and clients in a difficult position. So the answer to this, or the attempt to try and resolve this issue insofar as it's possible, is, I suppose, a slight back to the future moment. We go back to the with quantities contract, where the building or the civil engineering project has been designed by the employer. It's now mandatory that there's a bill of quantities, which is deemed to be also a with quantities contract. And the employer keeps the risk of any errors in that bill of quantities. And we look at in more detail how potential errors or discrepancies are dealt with. So the bill of quantities, essentially the builder or the contractor is allowed to just price the bill. Does not have to review the drawings and specifications, or obviously may wish to do so for common sense to understand where there might be areas for tendermanship, better pricing opportunities, but from a purely a very simplistic point of view, can just price the bill, and if there are errors in that, then they will be entitled to be paid extra as a result of that. For the quantity surveyors in the room, or the people who would describe themselves as cost consultants, as the Capital Works Management Framework refers to you, there is some interesting points to note here. As the person creating the bill of quantity, you are not allowed, according to the guidance notes, and the guidance notes on this are pretty good. They're not contractual, bear that in mind, they're not part of the contract necessarily, but obviously are useful. But what it says is that a cost consultant may not make assumptions to cover inadequate or incomplete design information. So if you get design information which you believe to be incomplete, you have to communicate with your designer, whoever that is in the team. And maybe that communication has to be facilitated through the employer. And you also must advise the employer and liaise with the designer where there are any design issues that cannot be adequately defined, because that is one of the, or can't be designed fully at tender stage, and that links to one of the areas where specialists may be required. This maybe, I don't know, people can tell me in the room, maybe this isn't anything new for quantity surveyors. Maybe they've normally had very robust exchanges with architects and civil engineers in terms of challenging their design and the adequacy of their design, but I wouldn't be quite as certain. I should have said this at the start, but one of the joys of working for a company like Eddie and James would be pleased, a company like Quigg Golden, is that I don't necessarily see the good in the industry. We live on the dark side of the force. People do not pay us to tell us about projects that went well, although we are happy to accept those commissions. That does colour my view on certain things, so if you have strong views in the opposite direction, please let me know. But those are interesting things for a cost consultant to have to deal with, apart from the actual labour-intensive bit of creating a bill that is now going to be the standard bearer for the contract, for which a contractor can rely on, and which a contractor will be poring over at will to find errors in that will allow a contractor to claim. It's a lot of pressure on a cost consultant. And I do enjoy putting pressures on quantity surveyors, but this does seem a slightly new level for them to have to worry about. I did give a talk on this in Dublin when they were first announced, and was a bit disturbed by PQS in the crowd who seemed quite perturbed that his PI might be affected by the fact that he now had to actually create a proper bill of quantities. It did beg the question as to what exactly he had been doing before. So there's no PI implication here as far as I can see. You just have to do your job properly if you're a quantity surveyor, but I accept that mightn't always be the most straightforward of tasks. So if there are consistencies in the documents, how are they resolved? Very straightforward, nothing that we wouldn't be used to before from traditional forms of contracting. They're all to be resolved by instruction from the employer's representative. So the employer's representative is to make a decision where these come up, and that will require a contractor to make a request in relation to that, to request an instruction. The works requirements will take precedence potentially over a bill of, and a compensation event may arise, and the may depends on the circumstances. So, where you have a works item, which is described in the works requirements but not in the bill of quantities. When I talk about the works requirements, I obviously mean the drawings and specifications. And we build to the drawing and specifications. We don't build to the bill of quantities. We price the bill of quantities, but we build to the drawing spec. So where we are building to our works requirements, we find that there's an item not in the bill of quantities. The contractor will be required to complete the works, if so directed by the ER, and shall be entitled to an increase in the contract sum. However, the ER can direct that that work doesn't go ahead. So maybe the design wasn't correct, it doesn't need to go ahead, and therefore there'll be no adjustment to the contract sum. Obviously, the ER is the person who decides, and that instruction must be sought by the contractor. This links in with the fact that 4.11 of the Public Works contract puts a certain onus on contractors in terms of how they request information, and most information must be requested at least 10 working days before it is required. So again, this isn't necessarily a total get-out-of-jail-free card for contractors. The rest of the contract continues to exist. So whatever obligations and requirements are in the contract will continue. So if you are a contractor and you see an error in the bill of quantities and something has not been included, the onus is on you to ask in a timely fashion how that should be dealt with. So if there's a works item described in the bill of quantities, so it's something that the contractor will have priced or will be deemed to have priced, but it's not on the drawings and specification, then again must seek an instruction from the ER and can either be directed by the ER to complete that works, will not be entitled to be an increase in the contract sum because that has already been priced, or alternatively can be directed not to complete that work item, and that will be omitted, and there'll be a downward adjustment in the contract sum. So relatively straightforward. Both the works requirements and the bill of quantities include an item, but there's an inconsistency in the quantity. So there's an error in the quantity. Again, it's about which one wins. If the ER decides that it's the works requirements quantity that is to be completed, then the contractor completes that level, and if there is an increase in the contract sum due, then he may be entitled to that. Because Schedule 1K, although it is now automatically a yes, continues to have a minimum of €500 on it. So if the change is less than €500, there'll be no change to the contract sum. If it's greater, then obviously there's a change. And in the opposite, we can direct that the amount or the quantity in the bill of quantities is what is required to be done, and there's no change to the contract sum, because that's what we priced already. So straightforward enough measures in terms of how this is dealt with. The potential for problems with all this is perfectly sensible, I would suggest. It's definitely fairer for contractors in how they can manage the risks that are passed to them, particularly where there was a poor bill of quantities produced, and it was all very easy for an employer to be told, well, to pass the quantities risk, and that just deals with it. I think this is a fairer way of doing it, particularly if it's employer design. But contractors, and those of you who work for contracting organisations, need to bear in mind it doesn't exist in a vacuum, okay? So it still exists in the overall context of the risk allocation that is set out at Schedule 1K. And the guidance note says this. So for example, if there's an unforeseen ground conditions and that risk has been passed to the contractor, there would not be an entitlement to an increase in the quantities, thereby an increase in the contract sum for having to import additional fill or remove additional material from the site. The classic way a contractor would have always sought to seek to get around the issues in relation to unforeseen ground conditions was to try and create a situation where the ER instructed him to do something else, and then claim that it was the instruction that's the cause, not the ground conditions. I took the risk of the ground conditions, but you gave me a change order. I'm only claiming in relation to the change order. That will continue, reasonably sensible thing to attempt. ER's responsibility to understand how to manage that. But again, bear in mind, one thing to say is that if you are drafting a bill of quantities or drafting works requirements documentation, This idea that unforeseen ground conditions would take precedence, being passed on, would take precedence over the Schedule 1K being a yes, isn't actually directly included in the contract, so you'd want to make sure that it's included somewhere in the works requirements, that you copy and paste that element from the guidance notes in there to make sure that that's captured. Some related issues in relation to just very quickly, again back to the point that the contract continues to breathe the fire it always had. It's still an unpleasant contract to try and use if you're a contractor. It doesn't, it has very hard edges, I suppose is the diplomatic way of putting it. ER communications, so a common thing is ER is maybe saying something as a direction, but actually where it's actual change order on how that might be managed. Contractors would need to be wary of that and seek to claim a compensation event where or have that investigated more fully under 4.5.2. The communications piece I mentioned already about needing to be aware of your timeframes when you need to request information to have it so that you can claim to be delayed by it. You need to have requested it. Condition precedents live on. Clause 10.3 survives in all of its glory, and we will talk about that on Clause 10 in all of its glory. We'll talk about that in the dispute resolution section of this. So it is still there. Just because this has happened, just because there's an inconsistency in the documentation, which means you are entitled as a contractor to additional payment, does not mean you are entitled to additional payment. You are only entitled to additional payment once you have put in the proper 10.3 notification. That lives on. It does not matter that the ER, the employer, and the dogs on all of the streets in all of Galway knew that you were instructed to do something. You are not entitled to get paid for it unless you actually put in a proper notification in relation to that. And just references to Schedule 1K are things we, in terms of late instructions, might be something that will be something that if ERs and their cost consultants are slow to deal with requests in relation to this, then that can lead to other claims for delay in relation to these matters. Specialist works procurement. So there have been some changes made here. I suppose the reason for this, or the predominant reason for this, was particularly on the M&E side, feeling that they've been hard done by the actions of contractors and of employers, in that maybe that their name has been taken in vain, where they have been used by contractors to allow them to as part of their team for pre-qualification and tendering purposes, but then they actually don't get to work. Contractor says he's going to show up with the best mechanical engineering firm in Ireland, and shows up with, if not quite the worst, definitely not in the top 20. Someone that's much smaller and obviously much cheaper. And maybe that doesn't deliver the quality that would have been anticipated at tender stage, and how that can be dealt with. One of the way, or what the Capital Works Management Framework has now tried to do, is clarify when and how specialists should be used. Specialists being a particular breed of, I suppose, subcontractor, or in some instances obviously would be consultants. And there's three basic tiers: little or no engagement. Subcontractors, just tax compliance. They're not specialists, they're just subcontractors. So your standard earth moving subcontractor who's just there with a truck and trailer doing some work. You may require as an employer to see that they're paying their staff properly, and the various requirements of Clause 5 would be part of that. But other than that, you don't have any interest in them. You may want to set pre-qualification standards. This is particularly relevant if in design and build projects. You might want that designers, or that specialist mechanical people, or electrical or glazing, or whatever this particular specialist might be, have a certain standard of management. That might be something that you're interested in having as an employer. But to go the whole hog, you may want to take full control of that and have direct tendering of specialist contractors or specialist works. So you are the employer and you're going to go out to the market yourself. And you can do this in two main ways. You can actually run a tender process and enter into a contract with a specialist, which is therefore novated to a contractor. Or now and that was always there, what is now new, and what some people have suggested is a return to nomination, is where you can tender to have a specialist, which is then you require the contractor to appoint. Not to spoil the surprise, but it is not a return to nomination. This is not nomination as we knew it. The main reason for that is that where in previous versions of nomination under IEI or IAI contracts, the subcontractor automatically became the contractor's problem, and that remains the same. But if there was, for any reason, the subcontractor or the nominated subcontractor went out of business or failed to perform and the contract was terminated, it was for the employer to reappoint under the more traditional nomination. In this instance, if a specialist, although they've been tendered for by the employer, failed to perform, still the contractor's problem, and if he has to ultimately get rid of them, or if they go bust, it's the contractor's problem to get a new one. And obviously that new specialist must meet the same standard as the old. Not obviously that would have a potential impact in relation to delay of a project for which a contractor would now be liable. So when would you consider naming specialists if you're an employer or if you're helping an employer? 3 broad categories. Early engagement is necessary. So if you are going down a D&B route, but you want to get the design started or a design team up and running to get planning, or you're wanting to use those to get them through the first phases of the Capital Works Management Framework, you might engage with those, contract with those at that point, and novate those across later to the contractor. If there was a particular specialist piece of kit that you required for your building, then you may also, because it had a very lengthy lead-in period, you may also wish to contract with a specialist or engage with a specialist at an earlier date. That would be a reason that the guidance notes will give you. The guidance note says that if the value exceeds 15%, then that is a reason to go and seek a specialist tenders for specialists. It's a perfectly arbitrary figure. There's no science behind it that I understand, but it is there. That's what it says. Or where it is not possible to accurately define the specialist works to enable them to be tendered as part of the main contract. So if you're an employer-designed contract and you don't have the skill set in your integrated design team, or don't know enough about a specialist area to actually design something sufficiently to allow a contractor to price it, then that or is a reason to go ahead and appoint a specialist separate to the main contract package. 3 main types of specialist. There's what we now have, which is the reserve specialist, which is the new one. We have novated specialist, and we have contractor or contractor designed works D&B specialists. The reserve specialist is the newest one we have, and really all this is where, as part of the procurement process, the employer and their team run 2 reasonably concurrent tender processes. They pre-qualify, so it's done under a restricted process on procurement, pre-qualify contractors and pre-qualify specialists, and then go out to tender separately for the contractors and for the specialists. The contractors tender is due in well before the specialist tender is returned. It's evaluated, and a preferred bidder, to use that language, is decided. So we know who is going to win. At that point, that information as to which contractor is going to win and that contractor's programme for the works is given to the restricted list of specialists who are pricing the works package, or whatever package that might be. They then have 2 weeks as envisaged, but you may give them longer to finalise their price. So they can finalise their price when they see that they're programming activities in a certain way, which mean we have to have certain resources on site, or also may just know that actually it's Pauric Marray Contracting doing this, and we've worked for him before, and he is a real pain in the proverbial to work for. Therefore, there's an additional management cost, there's additional risk we're taking on, and we're going to price that in. They feed that back in to the employer's team for assessment. That is assessed. The winner of the specialist tender is decided, and ultimately then they are joined together at the end, where the specialist and the contractor are told, the contractor is told, here are the specialists who have won, and when we appoint you, you are going to enter into a contract with them. You never enter into a contract with any of these specialists, but you acquire As part of the letter of acceptance, it will be a requirement that the contractor must enter into a contract with them. If a contractor doesn't wish to enter into contract with them, then he must turn down the work, or at least that's what the current system appears to suggest. Okay? So that is relatively new, but it's running 2 tender processes reasonably concurrently until the end. And practically, or at least, theoretically, it makes a lot of sense. Problems with it? It's more work for employers, it's more work for employers' teams. They may be having to tender very specialist packages by their very nature, which might be difficult to fully price or to fully describe, and might be something that's outside their normal comfort zone. But that's something they'll have to deal with. Theoretically, it should work. The ultimate, what the results of it will be, we don't quite know yet. And again, just the specialist contract, the contract to be used is defined as required to be the CIF's named and novated contract, which is entirely back to back with the current form of the public works contract. So that is a good thing, particularly for main contractors, but also for specialists, because it means it sets a minimum standard. If you're a specialist subcontractor, you know what you're getting. You know there's a minimum standard you're going to get into. That a main contractor won't have any harsher terms that you have to deal with. So you can tender with more certainty, which in construction, from a contractual point of view, uncertainty is not your friend. The more certainty you can create, the more likely you will be to have a happier and successful project, at least in its administration. Novation, I'm not going to dwell on it because it's been here before. Essentially, novation, the employer tenders the specialist package, but goes a step further and actually enters into a contract with the specialist. And at a certain point in time, that contract is novated across to the main contractor. And essentially, the main contractor replaces the employer in that contract. The contract remains exactly the same, but just the name of who the employer is changes. It's done most commonly for D&B, where you've had advanced designers involved at an earlier stage than where you got the contractor in, and then you just pass over your design team to the contractor. And it's a relatively common thing throughout. If the reserve specialist system is reasonably unique to Ireland, novation is not unique. It happens all over the world. The main contractor has to be told, given a copy of the novation agreement, understand how that novation is going to work, must know who the specialist is, and must be given the programme that the specialist is working to allow them to factor that into their own programme. Fairly standard, reasonably standard stuff. Where it's a design and build project, obviously you're not designing it. If you're the employer, you do not care, or you're not sufficiently involved in design, but you want to have some element of control. So in this area, you might set appropriate pre-qualification standards, or you may even go so far as to set up panels. You'd set up a panel of specialists from which the contractor is required to pick. That hasn't proven that successful in the past, because main contractors will maybe say one thing and then do another. For the greater level of certainty is in novation and in the reserve specialist system. By its very nature, if you're going down a D&B procurement route, you're less concerned about some of these things, shall we say. You are handing it across the responsibility for design and build to the contractor, because that's the right thing to do in that instance. From a pricing point of view, I'll leave those slides there. I won't go through them because we are well over time. But basically, whereas before we would have talked about PC sums from nomination, now we have a reserved sum. So where an employer is going out to tender for reserve specialists, basically every bill of quantities that a contractor gets to price, the contractor's price has the same amount in it. And they get to price for attendances, they get to price for their management, for their risk, and they have to get to put in profit on specialists. And if they put in 0 rates or 0 percentages, then that's as low as they can go. Minus percentages are taken to be 0, which is what it is, so relatively straightforward. New dispute management procedures. essentially here what we have in terms of the contract is the introduction of a less formal buffer. So the idea is two strands. One is the project board, which is required to be appointed on projects. And the idea behind this is it comes from to some extent from the fitted contracts, but it's a dilution of that, along with the standing conciliator, which you would also have in fitted contracts. Basically, the members are appointed. You have 1 to 3 members nominated from each side. They're not people who are directly involved in the project, but you must have one person who holds a construction-related role in each of the parties. They are part of a project board, and where a dispute has been referred to clause 13.1, which is conciliation, or the notice to refer to conciliation under the contracts, it is in the first instance referred to them. So they get to consider it. They only consider, again, clause 10 living on, they only consider matters that have been properly gone through the claims process. So where you've issued the proper original notice, the proper claim under 10.3, and the contractor has gone right through to rejecting the ER's assessment, even if that is by silence. So it doesn't help you as a contractor, or it doesn't change the rules if you don't properly notify of these things and don't properly manage it. And basically, it's a reasonably structured meeting. They supposed to meet at least every 60 days. They can meet more often if they wish, but they sit down and try and resolve matters amongst themselves. So without reference to a third party, they try and resolve things. They're not directly involved in it. Maybe there's taking some of the personality clashes out of the conversation, and that might allow people to resolve it. A very sensible idea. Obviously, there's a cost associated with it. If you are a small contracting body or you're a small public body, you can have external consultants appointed to the board to act on your behalf. Anyone who you have on the board, though, must have authority to bind you, whether you be a contractor or an employer. So one thing that might be worth mentioning if you are an employer is having the funder on some element or representation of the funder on the board. So if you ultimately can't sign off on something unless the Department of Finance say so, it would seem sensible that you have some representative from the Department of Finance on that project board to make it work or be efficient. They meet every 60 days, and the agreements they reach will be binding. Okay, so it's a binding agreement. If no agreement is reached, they inform the parties once their efforts have failed, and it's up to the parties to continue then move on with conciliation or drop the matter. Nothing has to proceed to conciliation. A new tier of conciliation has been introduced for projects over an estimated value of 10 million. This is an appointment of a standing conciliator. A conciliator who is appointed from the day the job commences and works on the project throughout the life of it. Where the contract is below 10 million, the employer has the option of requiring a standing conciliator to be appointed. So depends on the strategic importance of the project and the value of the project. It can be a very, very effective tool. The standing conciliator can chair the project board and can draft on and advise the agreement. It's a constant referee on the job. Whereas if you don't have a standing conciliator and matters are just referred to conciliation, then you just have the appointment or the agreement of a conciliator who he or she would probably know very little about the job until they have to be read into it. So there's a cost associated with that it has to be explained to them. It takes them 4 or 5 hours to do that, and they charge you for the pleasure of doing that. Whereas this, you have a standing conciliator who is constantly involved and maybe is able to resolve disputes before they get to what we might traditionally view as a dispute level. Again, very sensible approach. There's a reserved sum to be included in the contract, which is to be 50% of the fee, so the cost will be shared by the employer and the contractor. Again, it is something that has worked in other jurisdictions, where particularly under the fitted contract, where you have a dispute adjudication board, which again means that things are just that little bit more efficient when it does come to something that the people actually involved in doing the work can't resolve the matter. The, the, those are the changes. The other change, obviously, I mentioned at the start, is the Construction Contracts Act. And it, as far as I can see, has to some extent been ignored so far. And we are in our, maybe it's human nature, we are continuing to do what we've always done until someone else does something else for us or to us. But we haven't seen a significant uptake in relation to that just yet. But that will probably change over time. Ultimately, a standing conciliator working properly would mean that it would be very, very unlikely that something would be referred to an adjudication. But again, we are slightly looking into the future on that. There's no certainty on any of that. And if there are questions, I'm happy to take them. Yep.
On that last one there, commission construction contracts, 2013. Still a lined up question there for the ins on that one. Do you know of any cases that have been referred to adjudication with regard to the fact that there's a standing conciliation process in place now?
Well, the two might be linked. The standing conciliation process isn't available to all contracts, and obviously wouldn't affect some contractor and main contractor relationships, so it isn't a panacea for everything in construction. I'm not aware of any, unfortunately, in my line of work just yet. I know a number of the adjudicators. James Golden is on the panel. I know a number of other adjudicators are on the panel, and they have not been appointed to any adjudications just yet. That's not to say that there hasn't been. Okay.
Thanks, Pauric.
Cheers, Mark.